The laughter, joy, and lively conversations continue in the next room, but here I sit in silence, lost in my own thoughts. My heart feels heavy with a longing that I can't seem to shake off. A whirlwind of questions spins endlessly in my mind, but there's one question that stands out above the rest, echoing louder and louder as I think about it. It's a question directed at her. How could a woman who claims to love me be so cruel? Or was it never really love at all? It all began like a scene from a fairy tale, or at least that's how it felt in the beginning. Our meeting took place in a theater at a play called Love and Betrayal. At the time, I had no idea just how significant the title of the play would turn out to be, a kind of prophecy for what was to come in our relationship. I was there with a friend, and she was there with hers. As the crowd surged in the foyer after the show, she brushed past us, pushing us into the crowded, stifling space. After that moment, we didn't part ways. To me, she seemed like an angel who had fallen from the sky. She wore a silver dress that shimmered with elegance, its low-cut back revealing just enough to tease with seductive charm. After the play, we wandered through the city streets together, talking late into the night. Our conversation was deep and filled with curiosity about art, flower paintings, the emerging trends in sculpture. And 6 hours passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Before we knew it, dawn was breaking. I walked her home and, as we said our goodbyes, we made plans to meet again the next day. When the moment arrived, we kept our plans. The date unfolded as I'd hoped. A movie followed by a cozy cafe, and then a leisurely walk through the park. It felt like one of those perfect days, one you dream about but rarely experience. We ended up back at my apartment, and what began as an innocent evening slowly turned into something more. What followed, that night of passion, felt like the culmination of everything I'd imagined. When morning came, I couldn't believe how lucky I felt. I thought I had captured the bird of happiness in my hands, convinced that I had found something real. But as time passed, everything began to change. 2 months into our relationship, I started to sense a distance between us. It was subtle at first, like an invisible barrier I couldn't explain, but it grew stronger. Soon, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I couldn't let it drift. So, I decided to take the boldest step of my life. I arranged a romantic dinner at a fancy restaurant, complete with champagne, and I secretly slipped a ring into her glass. When the moment came, I got down on one knee and poured my heart out to her, asking her to marry me. When I looked up, I saw tears in her eyes. She said yes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur as we discussed everything that would change in our lives, how to organize the wedding, the guest list, the menu, and all the little details that go into planning such an important day. It all felt surreal, like a dream come true. A month later, we stood at the altar, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues. There were 90 people in attendance, all offering their congratulations, showering us with the usual blessings. Live happily ever after, have lots of kids, build a beautiful home, and drive a fancy car. The atmosphere was light-hearted and joyful, filled with hope and promise. But then came a moment that would shift everything. My boss rose from his seat, holding a glass in his hand, and began to speak loudly, his voice echoing across the room. "Daniel, Evelyn, I congratulate you both on this important milestone in your lives. I wish you love that lasts at least 100 years. There was a brief pause as his gaze seemed to linger on my fiancée. Then he added, "Evelyn, I think we've met before." The entire room fell silent. I felt my blood run cold as my boss continued, his words carrying an unsettling weight. "Yes, we met recently, and I think I know you a little better than I should." His tone was direct, without any hesitation. I could tell that the alcohol had loosened his tongue, making him say things he might normally have kept to himself. At that moment, I felt a deep sense of unease. I was furious, my mind racing with confusion and disbelief. My relatives quickly stepped in, trying to pull us apart before things escalated further, but the damage had already been done. My thoughts were a whirlwind, and I stormed over to Evelyn, who was sitting there in shock. When she saw the look in my eyes, she recoiled in fear, sinking into her chair as if trying to make herself disappear. Her face was pale, and tears started welling up in her eyes. The words that escaped her mouth were barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her voice was filled with panic, but I felt no relief. Instead, anger washed over me. If she had been a man, my reaction might have been different. In that moment, I wanted to hit her, but I couldn't, not because of my anger, but because I could never bring myself to physically harm a woman. So instead, I spoke coldly, almost mechanically. "I'll file for divorce myself. Don't worry about it." Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and walked toward the exit. I needed to get some fresh air to try to calm down and make sense of what had just transpired. I stepped out onto the porch and lit a cigarette, my hands shaking slightly as I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. The weight of the situation felt unbearable. It wasn't long before Evelyn appeared, running after me. She fell to her knees in front of me, desperate and pleading for forgiveness. "Danny, you have to understand. At the bachelorette party, we got carried away. We were having so much fun, and we ended up at a club. There were too many cocktails and some handsome guys. Well, I was so drunk, and I ended up with your boss. We went back to his place, and I regretted it so much. When he walked into the hall just now, I recognized him, but I thought it was all behind us. He was drunk too. I told myself." She trailed off, unable to finish her sentence, as tears streamed down her face. She kept begging me, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. It was just that one time. Please don't leave me. Not today, not on our wedding day. Don't do this in front of my family. Please, I'll be faithful. I promise. Let's start over. I'll be the best wife." But despite her pleading, despite the desperation in her voice, something inside me had broken. The trust was gone. The betrayal was too much. There was nothing left to salvage. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow. Goodbye," I said coldly, turning my back to her and walking back to the reception. As I re-entered the room, an eerie silence filled the space. The guests were murmuring quietly, unsure of what was happening. I stood before them, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Dear guests, thank you for being here today. Unfortunately, the wedding is canceled. Please be understanding and head home." I tried to force a smile, but it felt hollow. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, and I could hardly breathe. Without another word, I called a taxi and left. I went back to my bachelor apartment alone and filed for divorce that very same day. I also submitted my resignation at work, a clean break from everything that had been a part of my life. The process was swift. In the blink of an eye, my marriage was over before it had even really begun. Years passed since that day, and though I tried to move on, I couldn't forget what had happened. Recently, I heard from Aunt Jana's neighbor that Evelyn had been arrested due to a massive shortage at the company she had worked for. Apparently, she's still in prison. As for me, I remain a bachelor, hardened by the experience. I developed one firm belief that stays with me to this day. All women are traitors.